He called it the puppet show because there's just a fine balance, as you said, between having enough people, having too many people, and costing too much for your facility. But I always like to think of that puppet show effect.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we speak with Marilyn Burns, Principal of MMBG Consulting, Director of Portfolio Advisor Surgical Services at Premier Inc., and who has spent many years as the Director of Clinical Affairs of Medical Education at Symmetry Surgical. Marilyn began her career in sterile processing and has worked as a registered nurse leader in the operating room, cardiac cath lab, endoscopy lab, PACU, critical care, and other patient care areas in both the hospital and ASC setting. She brings more than 25 years of healthcare expertise to clinicians and colleagues and is an active member of AORN, ISHM, APIC, SGNA, AORN Sterilization Specialty Assembly, and attends AMI Sterilization Committee meetings. Marilyn authors many articles, CE workshops, and training activities on various topics relating to perioperative services and sterile processing. She is a graduate of the University of Tennessee, and in addition to her nursing degree, holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and marketing. So, Jeremy, as we explore in this interview, and everybody who's listening will hear coming in just a little bit, that we have a lot of interesting and coincidental commonalities with Marilyn, but she's got a diverse background and experience. And I know we're really just going to hone in on open versus laparoscopic procedures today, but I've had the pleasure of interviewing her for another one of my healthcare podcasts, and she did an amazing job, and it just made so much sense because she has spent a good deal of her career in education to have her join us for an episode here on First Case as well.
Yeah, Justin, I look forward to the audience getting to hear her take on open versus laparoscopic procedures and some of the challenges that we can face and how we can adjust to those challenges and modify our practices a little bit. I'm also excited for the audience to get the chance to hear her experience and how they can bring that forward in relation to how we move from laparoscopic now to robotic surgery, because I think that there's a lot of commonalities we can bring together.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, having some experience over a period of time and watching new and emerging technologies come forward and then how everybody adjusts and it becomes more common is going to be a central theme to this conversation. So we'll be right back with Marilyn Burns after a short break.
You're listening to the First Case podcast.
Joining us now is Marilyn Burns, Principal of MMBG Consulting. And Marilyn, welcome to the First Case podcast. Although I will say you and I have spoken for another interview on our sister podcast, Beyond Clean, about sterile processing. And everybody at the very beginning of this episode heard your bio. You've got an extensive background. You're involved in all of the many professional organizations in our industry. And today you're here to talk to us about open versus laparoscopic procedures. So thank you so much for joining Paul and Jeremy and myself today.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, I know we read that bio at the beginning, but I think one of the things I want to take a little bit deeper of a dive into before we get started with the interview is your background and experience and specifically around educating, because I think everybody on this podcast is an educator at heart.
Oh, yes. That is so near and dear to my heart, especially since we talked last time. I've thought more and more about how much I love educating and being around our clinicians all the time, if possible.
So where did you get your start? And as you moved your way through many different departments in the hospital, obviously the operating room, cardiac cath lab, endoscopy, PACU, you've really seen it from so many different perspectives. But what led you to surgery to begin with?
So that's a great question. I started out in sterile processing while I was in nursing school. And an interesting aside was I did mortgage loans prior to going to school to be a nurse. And so I knew most of the surgeons and had actually done loans for a lot of different people in the OR. So I had an in to get into sterile processing. And that's really when I kind of fell in love with the whole thing. Just because it was, I loved the environment and it was so fascinating to me. But as far as laparoscopic goes, I want to tell you a little bit about that, if I may, Justin.
Absolutely. But I have to tell you, when I left nursing, I did a year in mortgages so I could break into medical sales. So I didn't realize we also had that in common.
Oh, my goodness. We've got too much in common.
Okay, so this is funny because my experience also before I went to nursing school was in the financial services industry as well. So I did that. Yeah, I worked for a national bank and decided that I couldn't do that any longer, and went back to school, went to nursing school, and wound up in surgery.
Well,
so.
I found it gave me a little bit more control over the surgeons since they knew I knew about the finances.
Well, I interrupted you there, but why don't you tell us a little bit more about laparoscopic?
Well, I think this is an interesting thing because, of course, I started back in the early 90s, which was a few years ago, and just when laparoscopic surgery was coming on the market. But I got to do laparoscopic procedures right away because, one, I'm tall, and two, I'm left-handed. So back then, they thought that if you were left-handed, you had some kind of reverse osmosis brain that would make it easier for you to hold the laparoscopic instruments and look at the screen at the same time. So I always get a little tickled about that because, of course, my kids think I'm a total klutz at trying to do video games. But I'm really good at laparoscopy.
So I'm curious, in your experience, looking back as laparoscopic surgery has progressed, some of the considerations that we made early on for laparoscopic surgery in excluding patients from laparoscopic surgery, how has that changed over the course of your career and where it's at today?
Well, that's a great question because initially the patient selection was super strict because it was new and kind of uncharted. Obese patients, for instance, would not be a candidate at all, considered a high risk, even though now they actually have better outcomes usually if they have laparoscopic surgery, if they're able. Other things that are very different, I think originally it was, mostly GYN or diagnostic lap, and then finally lap choles. But even with a lap chole, which is the number one procedure now for laparoscopic surgery, it would be very tense trying to decide if the patient might be a candidate because of the ripeness, we called it, of the gallbladder, which now it's just the most preferred method regardless. It's about 80% are done laparoscopically, and open is so rare now.
So, Marilyn, you were talking about the rarity of opening. So what is your take on whether or not to have the open instruments in the room, open and ready to go, or to just have available, or have them out in the hallway just in case? How do you feel about that? What's your practice in that regard?
Well, that's changed a whole lot since I started because we were always expecting to have to open back in the early days of this and always had to have all the instruments in the room and that sort of thing. But now, very rarely would you ever even have the instruments pulled. They may be on a cart outside, but unless it's a patient that the surgeon believes may have to have it open for one reason or the other, you really just don't even have the instruments available and definitely don't have them counted like we used to do in the past. We used to be all expecting it to happen.
So another area of concern or question would be, with the advancement of all these different types of laparoscopic cases that are occurring now, what about the credentialing for new procedures? Or if Dr. Smith, who's been doing laparoscopic cholecystectomies for years, all of a sudden decides he's going to do a laparoscopic colon resection, hasn't done one there before, do they need additional proctoring, or what's the process that you recommend for that?
Well, it depends on the breadth of that surgeon's technique and laparoscopic experience. Now, for colon resection now, that's relatively new. So you would hope that he had some sort of, or she had some sort of training that they could document with you, or gone to a course or something like that. It would probably depend more on the facility. In my practice, that's what I would ask for, is some kind of proof, because if they didn't have a lot of experience, you would be that person. You would want to prepare for an open. And, we're also seeing a lot of laparoscopic surgeons who will do a hand-assisted colon resection, so that they've got a larger incision and they can pull that bowel out and work on it. It's sort of like an open as well. So it's a good question, and it's probably varies from facility to facility, but I am a safety girl, so I usually err on the side of caution and would ask for some proof of experience there, or maybe have an assistant that had more experience. A lot of times they'll add another surgeon as an assistant.
So, Marilyn, I wanted to follow up on that instrument line of questioning. We talked about the amount of instruments that you open or you have available for opening in case you do have to go to an open procedure. I'm curious about what you see, because this is where I think I see a lot of variety across the country, is the number of instruments that are opened for the actual laparoscopic procedure. So I go into facilities where they'll be they'll open a minor set, which has, 45 instruments on it, or other facilities that have pared those down to where they're opening, maybe 10 or 11 instruments. How do you recommend organizations adjust to that change and kind of get those instruments down to where they're more manageable?
So what I see in a lot of places is they'll maybe have a dedicated lap chole set, which will have just the very basic handheld instruments needed to open the procedure, some hemostats, a small retractor, something like that. And then the more important part, all of the laparoscopic instruments they would need in the same set, versus trying to open a minor set and then a laparoscopic set, or pull laparoscopic instruments separately. For some of the bigger procedures, they'd probably, go ahead and pull both.
Do you have a recommendation on how organizations or even the frontline workers can begin to have those conversations with surgeons about getting those instruments down to a more manageable level?
Wow, that's a great question. That always depends on the strength of the person asking the question and the ego of the surgeon, not in a bad way, just in their general demeanor, because it's always, and it's very pervasive now in the OR, not just for laparoscopy, but for other procedures as well, to try to do set optimization and reduce the number of instruments in the tray, just because of the costs associated with that. It's just generally better to pare down those trays. So I would say to start that conversation with the surgeon. My technique may be a little different than others, but I would say you would want to go ahead and show them at the end of a procedure all the instruments that weren't used, and see if they could start to understand. And it may not be the first time they notice. It may be 3 times down the road, but they may begin to understand and think about what they actually need, because they don't have to have a honking Raptor retractor for every procedure anymore available. So I think that's where I would start, is just trying to show them the reality of the situation and what they've actually used.
I think that's a great recommendation, and one that's easy to put into practice.
So here's a quick question for you. You talked about not having to count the open surgery instruments. do you count the laparoscopic instruments when you're doing a laparoscopic case, or no?
Most facilities don't do that anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I've seen it both ways across the country, but
Right.
it just seems like a waste of time.
It really does. There's not a way to lose that long laparoscopic instrument in the abdomen.
But they should still be inspected, right?
They should still be. Oh, don't get me started on that one. They definitely should be inspected. I write programs on that, Paul.
Yeah.
Findings on that.
That's a really interesting point, what you were just saying about inspecting the instruments, because not always does the entire instrument obviously go inside of the patient. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes people think, Paul, I know you were saying that with a smile on your face, but a lot of times people think that means that they don't need to be inspected. And the thing is, with the insulation, it's a heat shrink material that's on those most of, not all, but most of the laparoscopic instruments. That insulation can shrink back. You can see arcing. And, during the procedure, you don't see about 67% of where the instruments are. You just see the very distal end of maybe a grasper or a scissor, and you see from only the vantage point of the distal end of the scope. And so everything that's happening between the entry point to the patient to that point is kind of an unknown. And if there's a hole in that insulation, that can burn a patient. It can wind up having complications that nobody would be aware of until they start to rear their ugly head, not long after, but days potentially after the procedure with elevated temps.
Yep.
I think that's kind of I remember when I first started educating in this industry, the company that I worked for had a booth at the AORN annual conference and expo. And this was the topic that I spoke specifically on. And I can't tell you how many people walked up to me and said, I had no idea that there could be holes in the insulation that could burn the patient and that we wouldn't even know that it happened.
Well, just to relay a quick story, back in the late 80s, where I was working at a facility where a GYN surgeon that was pretty advanced at that point in time in doing operative laparoscopy had a patient who ended up dying later because the patient had a bowel injury from an electrocautery, and it destroyed that physician. They blamed him for it when it could have very easily have been the insulation on that instrument. And a year later, he ended up dying of a heart attack. He was under so much stress from that. One other instance where a Marilyn dissector broke inside of a patient and didn't realize that and that's why you got to inspect those at the table before you end the procedure.
Yes,
right?
I totally agree.
Yeah, I think that's the really important part is it's not only inspecting on insertion, but it's also inspecting once you're finished with the instrument. I think, Paul, that's an excellent point to bring up.
Yeah, definitely. I think that as time has progressed, we start, and I've said these words before, I probably shouldn't admit it, that laparoscopic surgery in some ways is becoming general surgery, as far as we're so used to the instruments now and the process and the procedure that it's not, we take it a little bit for granted that a grasper is not going to be as stable if it's laparoscopically as it would be if it were just a hemostat, for instance. But we feel the same way about it because we're doing so many laparoscopic procedures and we're using the same sets over and over. And it's a great point that we need to make sure we inspect those every time that they're being used, both in sterile processing and on the table when the case is opened.
And I think sometimes just diagnosing issues, like even before the patient, like when you're looking at the equipment, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people like saying, oh, this scope is bad. And then they get another one and they're like, it's still blurry or it's still dark. And they keep changing out scopes and they don't realize that the issue is, either the camera or the light cord, depending on the issue. And so you really have to diagnose all the equipment that's being used in the procedure to be sure that you're just not swapping out a good piece of equipment for another good piece of equipment, not realizing what's causing the issue in the surgeon's experience.
Exactly. I've seen that happen.
What about staffing on laparoscopic cases? Do you always have somebody holding the camera? Do you have two techs in on those cases? Or what's your philosophy on that?
Well, we usually try to have the scrub nurse that manages the back table and can also come forward if necessary, and it's a difficult case. And then an assistant is what we would call it to the surgeon. So that's usually another nursing team member. But the days are gone where you had a scrub at the table, an assistant at the table, and a surgeon at the table, unless there's just a very difficult case or procedure being done. But I do think somebody should be holding the camera for the surgeon.
I've worked in teaching facilities, that sometimes is a medical student or a resident that'll be holding the camera. I think there's some other options there that I've seen in other facilities.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which is great, yeah. But a lot of community hospitals don't have them. And then, so the only reason I ask this is because then it reflects in the productivity of the people in the operating room and what's their productivity standard. And then you have all kinds of issues if they're always having to have that person in the room. Great, but you got to factor that in to the equation and make sure that the hospital understands that they're not,
exactly.
When they're comparing productivity.
Right. And if you have too few people, we have what one of my surgeon friends called it the puppet show. Everybody's got two things in their hand. It might be a camera and an instrument. It might be two instruments, or it might be heaven only knows what else. But he called it the puppet show because there's just a fine balance, as you said, between having enough people, having too many people, and costing too much for your facility. But I always like to think of that puppet show effect because it brings me to another topic I'm pretty passionate about, which is we all like to talk about the advantage of laparoscopic surgery, but laparoscopic surgery does have some pretty tough ergonomic effects on surgeons and the teammates from the way that they're required to hold the instruments, and also the positions sometimes they get in to be able to see what they need to see with the camera.
What are some of the other pros and cons? I mean, I think it's important. I think a lot of times everybody thinks that it's all pros, and you just kind of outlined a con for us, but what are some other pros and cons? Let's just flesh that out a little bit.
That's a really good thing to talk about. So laparoscopic surgery does have tremendous advantages. We all have heard of how wonderful it is to have the small incisions so you can still wear your bikini or your Speedo. The cosmetic effect is better. There's typically lower blood loss, less tissue trauma. You can go back to work faster, which people don't always, when I'm speaking on this topic, they don't always see that as a positive. I usually get some moans on that one.
It's a pro or a con. Just pick the choice for you.
Return to normal activity. That's a little bit better than saying back to work. But one thing that I think is the patients perceive laparoscopic surgery to be the best always, and they have such a positive opinion of that the patient will prefer it regardless maybe of what they're told about some of the other issues they might have, and insist on a laparoscopic procedure. So that's kind of a positive and a negative because they do feel positive about it, but it could have some ramifications on their care if they insist on laparoscopic, even though their surgeon may think they need an open.
And Marilyn, let me ask you real quick. One of the biggest impacts on that perception and length of stay is pain, correct?
Correct. That's really important. There's typically less pain with a laparoscopic procedure, especially because the incisions are so small. So they do perceive it as to be pain-free, which led me right into a disadvantage because the perception of the patient is that this is an easy procedure. And so a lot of times they're just saying, oh, this is great. I agree. And they're not listening to what the possible issues could be, the negative impact of the surgery, or what the complications might be, or what they can't even expect, because you are going to have some pain, right? And they need to hear that, because sometimes if they just have the typical outcomes is to have some retained gas and you have a little pain in your shoulder, and the patient might get very upset and think that something's horribly wrong because they just were thinking this is the greatest thing that ever happened to have a laparoscopic procedure, and they did not listen correctly to what some of the complications might be or what to expect.
So on another subject here, bariatric laparoscopic surgery, I think that's really in the last few years taken off quite a bit. Are there special considerations that have to be taken into effect when you're doing that? And what about instrumentation? Do you need extra long instruments at times? And
sometimes you do, yes. I discussed a little bit earlier, but being obese is more common than ever in the United States now, and it's not necessarily a complete contraindication to having a laparoscopic procedure. But there are things that you do need to have on hand, such as the longer instruments. You also need to be aware that if the patient is obese, there are some things, if they're put, say, in steep Trendelenburg or something, the weight of their abdomen, even though it's insufflated, and their organs inside shifting because of the size, can cause some effects on their breathing and that sort of thing. So there are definitely some things you need to take into consideration for the bariatric lap surgery other than just the instrument size. You need to make sure they're positioned properly and that the team is aware to check on those things regularly.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point too, is that we do often in laparoscopic surgery put patients in very awkward positions to try to get the camera view that you want. And so making sure that we understand the appropriate way to secure the patient to the table and do so in a safe manner, just because of the movement that we often do to get those camera angles.
Right. And sometimes you do forget.
Yeah.
And not bending and breaking the instruments too, right? I mean, that's sometimes...
Not if you want a manageable repair budget.
Never use your laparoscopic instrument as a fulcrum.
Well, Marilyn, this was awesome. As always, the time flies by, but you've done a great job. But before we wrap, I wanted to ask you if there's anything you wanted to add before we wrap up.
Well, I think we've hit laparoscopic procedures pretty hard, but we didn't talk about open procedures. There are still some reasons that you would have an open laparotomy. So the number one thing is that, and this is also circles back to the laparoscopic instruments, is that with an open procedure, the surgeon can feel the organs and the pathology with his hands. And so some of the worst things that you will see as far as complications with laparoscopic surgery has to do with that tactile feel is gone and their depth perception is different. So while laparoscopic surgery is growing by leaps and bounds, we all want the benefits of that. We still need to remember that it's also sometimes necessary that we do open procedures.
Excellent, Marilyn. Great job, as always, I can say, since this is the second time I've had the pleasure of speaking with you on a podcast. But I want to thank you for taking some time to lay out the pros and the cons of open procedures versus laparoscopic procedures. So thanks again for coming on this episode of First Case.
Okay, thank you for having me.
That was Marilyn Burns, principal of MMBG Consulting. And Paul, this is a great conversation, and I think Marilyn made a really good point about how these procedures have become so common, almost treat them as second nature to everybody out there. And now we're talking about robotics in the light that we would have talked about laparoscopic procedures many years ago.
That's right. And, you have to remember, this is surgery. And there are always challenges that could occur during an operation. But she really laid it out well, and I think she answered some of the questions we have that from the different practices we see across the country. Both Jeremy and I have gone all over the country, and the practices are not the same everywhere. But I think her answers really kind of steer people in the right direction in terms of where they need to go. So it was a great talking to her. I really enjoyed it.
At some point, we're going to have to talk to somebody about repair and damages, because that seemed to leak in inspection, really seemed to creep into this conversation. And I know it's so prevalent with lap procedures because the damages, and especially the equipment like rigid scopes, which are entirely filled with glass, really can all of a sudden hit the budget for the operating room pretty hard if things get out of hand. All right, well, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support First Case by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Paul and Jeremy and myself, thank you for listening to this episode of First Case.